Saint Teresa once wrote that God allowed her to see what happens to a soul in the first moments after death. She said it was not a vision given to satisfy curiosity, nor a scene of dramatic horrors, but a revelation so clear and so truthful that it left her trembling long after it ended. It was, she said, a warning for every soul that still walks in this world. She explains that during deep prayer, when her mind was quiet and her heart lifted toward God, she suddenly felt herself drawn into a light she could not describe. In that light, she understood she was being shown the state of a soul at the very instant of death, not hours after, not days, the first minutes, the moment when the veil falls away and a person stands alone before eternity. She writes that she did not see angels carrying the soul upward or demons dragging it downward. She saw something far more terrifying, the soul awakening to the truth of itself. In that moment, the soul sees its entire life with perfect clarity. Nothing is hidden, nothing is excused, nothing is softened. The smallest sins appear with the same sharpness as the greatest ones, because the soul can no longer lie to itself. Teresa understood that this first awakening is unbearable for those who lived carelessly, who postponed repentance, who assumed they would change later. The soul that loved truth is drawn toward God. The soul that rejected truth recoils from him instinctively, as if fleeing a fire it cannot endure. She said the shock of this moment is so great that it marks the soul forever. And God allowed her to see it so that she might understand how quickly judgment arrives, how instantly truth is revealed, and how crucial it is to live with a heart that is ready for that final awakening. Teresa said that what God showed her next was far more dreadful than the vision itself. It was the understanding that came with it, the realization that the first minutes after death are shaped entirely by the life a soul has lived. No angel announces this. No voice speaks it. The soul simply knows it with absolute certainty, as if the truth had been waiting in silence for this one moment to reveal itself. She wrote that the first thing a soul experiences is light, not an external radiance, but a piercing interior clarity. This light shows the soul exactly what it is. Every choice made in secret, every sin ignored, every grace refused, now stands before it like a mirror. Teresa stressed that this is not accusation. It is recognition. The soul sees itself as God has always seen it. She said a soul that lived in friendship with God rushes toward this light with a relief beyond words. But the soul that clung to sin recoils in horror, not because God has condemned it, but because the sight of itself becomes unbearable. In her writings, Teresa describes the spiritual shock of a soul that dies unprepared. One moment it is surrounded by earthly distractions, the next it is standing before an eternal truth it cannot escape. She understood in her vision that the soul instinctively moves toward the destination it has chosen throughout its life, toward God if it sought him, away from him if it rejected his grace. This, she said, was the true terror of the first minutes after death. Nothing new is decided, nothing new is judged. The soul simply sees what it has become. And God allowed her to witness this, not to inspire despair, but to teach her, and through her us, that the decisions we make each day silently shape the eternity we will meet in that first, unforgettable moment after death. Among the visions St. Teresa received, none struck her with deeper fear than the sight of a soul falling away from God in the very moment of death. She said the experience was so sudden, so final, that it shook her to the core and remained engraved in her memory for the rest of her life. She describes being lifted in prayer when she suddenly perceived the fate of a man she had known, a priest who had recently died. She does not give his name nor any details about his life. She only records what God allowed her to witness. She writes that the instant his soul left his body, She saw it plunge downward with the weight of a stone dropped from a great height. There was no hesitation, no pause, no moment of resistance. It fell by its own spiritual gravity. Teresa said the speed of this fall revealed something terrible. The soul was not pushed. It was not dragged. It simply went where it had chosen to go during life. She writes that the demons seized him only after the fall had begun, almost as if they had been waiting for a claim that already belonged to them. Their fury was not the cause of his descent, but the expression of a reality already fixed within him. She said the sight lasted only a moment, yet its impact was immeasurable. It revealed that grace, once rejected, becomes judgment, that the choices we make silently form the weight of the soul, and that at death, the soul moves with frightening speed toward the destination shaped by its love, or its lack of it. Teresa confessed that after witnessing this fall, she prayed constantly for priests, especially those in hidden sin. She said she could not erase the image of the soul dropping away from God as effortlessly as a stone sinks into darkness. It was God's warning to her, and through her to us, of what happens when grace is offered again and again, but never embraced. Saint Teresa often said that God does nothing without purpose, and that every vision given to a soul carries a lesson meant not only for the one who sees it, but for all who come after. She believed this especially about the terrifying scenes he showed her concerning death, judgment, and the first awakening of the soul. These were not visions she requested. They were not images she wanted. They were truths entrusted to her. She writes that when God allowed her to witness the fall of a soul, or the terror of a conscience suddenly exposed, it was not to overwhelm her, but to awaken her. She said he permitted her to see the consequences of sin, so that I might understand the value of grace. For Teresa, the purpose of these visions was not fear, though fear certainly came, but clarity. She learned that one of the greatest dangers in the spiritual life is forgetfulness, the quiet drifting of the heart, the slow dullness of conscience, the belief that there will always be more time. God shattered that illusion by letting her see what happens when time ends. In her writings, she says that after these revelations, she could no longer take lightly the smallest sin, nor assume she would always have another day to repent. The sight of a soul awakening to truth, or falling from grace, created in her a burning desire to remain always close to God. She prayed more fervently. She made sacrifices for others. She interceded especially for priests, because she saw how easily holiness can be lost when charity grows cold. But she also realized something more, that God allows his friends to witness horror so they may help prevent it. She wrote that the visions were not given for her alone, but for every soul who might one day hear her words and turn back to God before it is too late. And so she carried these warnings like a torch through the darkness, because the truth she saw was meant to save, not to destroy. Although Saint Teresa witnessed terrifying scenes concerning the first moments after death, she never allowed anyone to forget that God's mercy stands at the center of every vision. She said that even when a soul awakens to its own sins with unbearable clarity, it is still surrounded by a mercy far greater than its fear. God does not abandon the dying. It is the soul that often turns away. She wrote that in one vision she saw how God approaches the soul at the moment of death with a tenderness beyond human understanding. She understood that Christ comes near not to condemn, but to draw the soul into his light. Yet the soul responds according to the truth it has chosen. The one who loved God recognizes him instantly and runs toward him. The one who resisted grace recoils from the very presence that could save it. This, Teresa said, is one of the great mysteries of the first minutes after death. God comes to every soul, but not every soul can endure his nearness. His mercy is the same for all. The difference lies in the heart that stands before it. She explained that a soul in the state of grace feels overwhelming relief, as if finally returning home after a long exile. But a soul in mortal sin experiences the opposite, an instinctive retreat from the light it spent a lifetime refusing. Teresa saw that God does not change in that moment. The soul's relationship to him does. Yet even in this terrible contrast, she found consolation. She realized that as long as a person is alive, no matter how dark their life has become, mercy can still transform them. The vision taught her that the final moment is shaped long before it arrives, through prayer, repentance, confession, and the humble seeking of God's will. For Teresa, this understanding turned fear into compassion. She prayed even more fervently for sinners, and especially for those furthest from grace, because she knew how much Christ still desired to save them in those final, decisive minutes when eternity begins. Saint Teresa said that one of the greatest secrets God revealed to her was that the first judgment a soul experiences after death does not come from angels, nor from devils, nor even from the voice of God. It comes from within the soul itself. It is the soul's own awakened conscience that speaks first, and this voice, she wrote, is impossible to silence. In her writings, Teresa explains that the moment the soul leaves the body, the mind becomes perfectly clear. Every deception falls away. Every excuse dissolves. Every rationalization that once softened sin vanishes in an instant. What remains is truth, pure, penetrating truth, that the soul cannot escape or reinterpret. She said this interior judgment is so swift and so absolute that it leaves the soul stripped of all illusions. Teresa described this awakening as a moment when the soul suddenly sees the full weight of every grace it received and every grace it ignored, the missed opportunities, the resisted inspirations, the moments of pride, anger, impurity, or indifference, all rise before the soul in a single, overwhelming vision. The soul recognizes how many times God reached out, how many times it turned away, and how each choice shaped what it has now become. She wrote that for the soul that loved God, this judgment is sweet. It sees its imperfections, yes, but it sees them through the mercy it embraced. It recognizes its weakness, but it knows it fought to remain in grace. This brings peace, not terror. But for the soul that rejected God, Teresa said the interior judgment becomes unbearable. The soul sees the truth of what it freely chose, and this self-knowledge becomes the source of its torment. God does not condemn it, the soul condemns itself. This, she said, is one of the most terrifying truths about the first minutes after death. Judgment begins in the heart, and the heart reveals what it has become. And the destiny of the soul unfolds from the truth it can no longer deny. Saint Teresa wrote that after the soul passes through the first shock of self-judgment, it becomes aware of something even more overwhelming, the nearness of God. She said this encounter is not like visions seen on earth, nor like images formed in the imagination. It is a direct awareness of the divine presence, pure, infinite, unmistakable. Nothing can prepare the soul for it. She explained that the soul does not see God with eyes, nor hear him with ears. It perceives him the way the body feels fire, instantly, completely, irresistibly. She said the soul knows, in a single moment, that it is standing before the one who created it, the one who sustained it, the one who sought it through every moment of life. This recognition fills the soul with either indescribable joy or indescribable fear. For the soul that loved God, Teresa said this moment is like stepping into sunlight after a lifetime in darkness. All the wounds of life vanish, all the doubts disappear. The soul feels itself drawn toward him with a longing that becomes almost unbearable in its sweetness. Teresa wrote that such a soul flies toward God as iron flies to a magnet, unable to resist the pull of divine love. But for the soul that rejected grace, The nearness of God becomes agony, not because God desires its suffering, but because the soul, having chosen sin, cannot endure the purity it once fled. Teresa said the soul recoils from this light, as a wounded eye recoils from the sun. The presence that should have been its joy becomes its torment, not by God's will, but by its own interior disposition. She understood then that heaven and hell are not merely places, they are states of the soul's relationship to God. And when the soul meets him in those first minutes after death, it simply moves toward the destiny it has already chosen. This encounter, she said, is the moment that reveals everything. Saint Teresa wrote that one of the most astonishing truths God revealed to her is that a lifetime is judged in a single moment, not because God rushes the soul, but because the soul, in the light of divine truth, understands everything at once. She said that at the moment of death, the soul comprehends its entire earthly journey with a clarity deeper than any earthly understanding. She explained that the soul sees not only what it did, but what it could have done. It recognizes how every action, every intention, every word, and every silence contributed to its final state. What seems small on earth appears significant in eternity. What was dismissed as harmless becomes heavy. What was done out of love shines like fire. What was done out of pride stands out like a wound. Teresa wrote that the soul sees the value of every grace God offered. Grace is accepted, grace is rejected, and grace is ignored. It understands how even the smallest acts of charity, purity, humility, or patience became treasures that drew it closer to God. And it also sees how repeated sins hardened the heart little by little, turning small choices into permanent dispositions. She said, this vision is not meant to crush the soul, but to reveal the truth it had created by its own freedom. God does not impose this understanding. The soul arrives at it naturally, as if awakening from a dream into undeniable reality. For the soul that cooperated with grace, this moment becomes a deep consolation. It sees how God used every sorrow, every trial, every sacrifice to purify and strengthen it. The meaning of its entire life becomes clear, but for the soul that resisted grace, the same clarity becomes unbearable. It realizes how many opportunities were wasted, how many sins were never confessed, and how much love was refused. Teresa said, this is the moment when the soul finally understands what it has chosen to become, and this truth alone sets the path it must now follow. Saint Teresa wrote that after the soul confronts truth, after it meets the presence of God, and after it understands the full weight of its life, there comes a final moment, quiet, solemn, irreversible, when the soul simply moves toward the destiny it has chosen. She said this movement is not forced, it is not commanded, it is the natural unfolding of a lifetime of decisions made freely. She explained that the soul, in that moment, does not debate, it does not hesitate, it goes where it belongs with a certainty deeper than thought. The soul that loved God moves toward him with a longing that becomes its joy. The soul that rejected grace turns away from him by its own inclination, fleeing the very light that could have saved it. Teresa said this final choice is not something new. It is the revelation of what the soul chose again and again through its actions, desires, and habits while living on earth. In that moment, the masks fall away, the excuses vanish, and the truth of the heart stands alone. She wrote that this is the most solemn act of human freedom, the soul embracing the eternity it has shaped. Yet Teresa insisted that God's mercy remains visible even here. She said that as long as a person is alive, grace is offered relentlessly. God calls, invites, forgives, and waits with a patience beyond understanding. No soul is lost because God refused it. Souls are lost because they refuse Him until the very end. This was the heart of her warning. The first minutes after death do not change us. They reveal us. They uncover what we loved, what we sought, what we served, and eternity unfolds from that truth. Teresa carried this knowledge with trembling humility. It made her pray constantly for sinners, for priests, for the dying, and for her own soul. She believed that if we understood what happens in those first minutes after death, we would live every hour differently. And now she passes the warning to us, not to frighten, but to awaken, so that when our moment comes, the truth we meet will be the truth we have prepared to embrace.